Mr. Khan, thank you so much for joining us today. You're here to talk about your thoughts on the changing dynamics of South Asia societies and how that relates to security. Particularly as a subsection of that, technological revolution or change. What are your thoughts on that issue?
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here, as usual, and I'm quite privileged to be here. And of course, you have brought in a very interesting subject that we've been studying, and of course, technology is one of the major concerns that we are dealing at both the statist level as well as the societal level, and this has a clear implication with both economics as well as the security. Now, if you look at South Asia as a whole, you have seen a phenomenal growth of information and communication technology, and perhaps the growth is faster than any other region that you have seen in a given time span. Now, if you take 5 years, last 5 years, the growth is almost like 50 to 60% of mobile penetration, internet penetration, getting Facebook into your livelihood. Then, of course, you have Twitter, and now you have Viber and everything. So the communication has fundamentally changed the structure of society as well as the structure of state. Now, if you take the state into consideration, we no longer are very concerned about the boundary. Now, the whole idea of identity and nationalism is also changing because you are now more connected to the world, which is not defined by the border any longer. So I can just get in touch with somebody who's in Australia and probably who is also an European. So therefore, this barrier is no longer there. So your concepts are changing. So you're thinking faster than ever, and you're responding to a problem faster than that you used to do in the previous years. So the yesteryears and the current years and the future years will be completely different. Now, the way we see the state, the youth that you see in South Asia, almost like 50% plus or minus, is under 35. Now, these are the people who once knew reform. They're now thinking the society and state in a very different way than Locke or Rousseau or perhaps Mahatma Gandhi or perhaps Aristotle ever thought about. So therefore, we need to think that how this ICT technology is actually changing the societal makeup or makeover of these countries. So that calls for a political issue as well. Now you're responding to the problems, as I said, so you're also responding to the political demands and supplies. So now whether the state is able to understand, the voices are now becoming much more louder. So which calls for the state to take more coercive measures. Of course, you're now changing laws, particularly Bangladesh has recently seen a change in law, which actually enables the state to detain and deter anybody to establish their expression of speech. Now, this sort of freedom as well as security debate is clearly creating new types of tension that you can see. So the tension between the Westphalian idea of state and the tension between the individuals more equipped and empowered with technology. So you can now see the tension between the political institutions and the individual institutions are also becoming challenged. Now this challenge is phenomenal. Now whether the countries of South Asia, the states of South Asia are actually able to comprehend and to act according to the phenomenal pace that is happening is certainly a big issue. So therefore the concept of state is changing, concept of politics is changing, and of course the idea of security has fundamentally changed.
Well, then let me ask you this follow-up question then. If you say that things are changing, that the state, to put it a different way, the legitimacy, the foundation of the state itself may be eroding a bit because of new methods of thinking, new approaches of social interaction, and technological connectivity. Where do you see the trend going? Is this a temporary blip that will cause reform within the state and a new kind of concept of state and civil society will emerge? Or are we looking at something more fundamentally altered than the kind of traditional Westphalian concept of state?
Well, this is complicated in a sense. You need to engage different levels of analysis here, of course. If you take it from an individual perspective, obviously it is true that the borders are becoming eroded. But on the other hand, there is also a sense of identity coming back. Now, if you take the politics in India, of course, now you have a new government there, Modi government that came in 2014, which is kind of like slightly different than the traditional concept of secular state or secular political party, as we read in the newspaper. Again, if you take the Bangladesh government struggling with the secularism, because one hand you have the extremists rising, on the other hand you have the secularist perspective and philosophies in place. And Pakistan is, of course, struggling with this for a long time. And with these three different ideas or ideologies of states are actually now bringing the whole identity issue back. So identity will be there. So therefore, for the individual, one hand they're becoming cosmopolitan, but on the other hand, the economy is yet in a position where they're not able to respond or act like a cosmopolitan individual. So you get a kind of a like mixed reaction. So that's on the individual ground. If you take in the social ground, of course, the society is changing. You will see over the 5 to 10 years of time, the societies will become much more open than ever, because now you have access to different information and everything. So culture is coming in. So you are now exporting culture as well as you are importing culture. So therefore, this culture will make sure that the society is able to comprehend and understand the global structure in more efficient way, which means you're now becoming more connected to the global structure, which even 10 years back was quite slow. So that's again, and if you take the state itself will always be becoming more protective, because national interest comes in, national security comes in, and the whole idea of state is to retain its own power. Now, unfortunately, three of this country are yet to be liberalizing their own ideas of state per se, because government believes in retaining the power. Now, this power struggle between the individual and the state will become acute. So therefore, the idea of state will remain, however, the nature of the state will completely different. That the problem is if the governments or the states are not able to understand this phenomenal change, of course you would be seeing more conflicts coming in. Now the conflicts are no longer like state to state, of course the conflicts are within. So the within conflict will be a major domestic internal security threat. So what I see is that the architecture of domestic security structure is more volatile than the international or external influences coming into South Asia. So it is our responsibility, hence South Asia. So South Asian people need to understand that, the government needs to understand that, and political institutions has to reform. It cannot be no longer a feudal system. The sooner they understand, the better it would be for them. So the state is going to stay here, but the idea of state will be completely changed. The idea of government will be completely changed in the next 10 to 15 years of time. Now, of course, where this change will lead us to, we are yet to see. It's very difficult to find it out right now, because the 5 years was faster. Next 5 years will be fastest, and then we will see where this phenomena goes in.
If I could ask you one follow-up question, one last question. You mentioned that the challenges that this whole process entails for the states of South Asia, that there will need to be political reforms, there will need to be reforms. And it's going to be a challenge for the states of South Asia to adapt. You mentioned the idea that the states can no longer be set up on a kind of feudal mentality. Is that what you think is the starting point? Like if you had to start somewhere in preparing the state to deal with these changes, what would be the kind of path you would initially walk down to get going in the right direction?
Well, Jeff, I think when we talk about political reform is essentially how the political institutions functions in these countries. We're certainly, it's the very interesting time in South Asia that all the countries are actually pursuing democracy as the state ideology. But the problem is somewhere else, whether these values of democracy is being implemented everywhere. Whether this whole idea of democracy is the politics of number, you just go and vote because this is what you mean by democracy, then it is not working. If you read the blogs, if you read the Facebook status, if you read the online journals, articles, now you're getting new ideas, the reform ideas. So I think the first challenge will obviously come from the youth that is becoming much more empowered. And of course, the youth will be backed up by the seniors. The reason is seniors need to also understand this change is inevitable. So therefore, I think there will be a collective push that we will see over the course of time to reform the political parties to become more pro-public rather than the pro-government or pro-statist. And we have to understand that. Now, whatever the case of Europe or whatever we have seen in the United States, the realities and social structures are completely different in South Asia, right? So this is something we often tend to ignore. Now, if we bring the American perspectives or prescriptions of democracy to South Asia, largely it didn't work, to be honest with you. I mean, of course, we have democracy there, we have some culture, of course, we have some institutions, but that doesn't mean that has fulfilled what we call public aspirations. So the mass still feels not being connected to the statist decision making as well as with the policy making structure. So you are creating some kind of difference, gap. Now, if you take the economic indicators, yes, we are phenomenally growing, but on the other hand, the relative poverty has become higher. Now, the gap between the rich and poor is phenomenally high, but that doesn't mean the poor has become or will always remain poor, but they have improved their livelihood, but the gap will always be there. So how do we address that? That remains as a major concern. So it cannot be done by thinking everything in the prism of national interest, but what I used to call, or what I often call, the public interest. Now, there is a term of public interest, which is colonially being used by the state to do whatever they want to do in the name of public. But here, the public interest must be that the public is actually engaged in the decision making. So until you do that, obviously, you're not going to go anywhere. So the conflicts will always be there. So as long as the empowerment goes on through technology, the state doesn't understand it, or the difference between these two, I don't think we will see a very harmonized, very peaceful internal security to come in over the period of time.